right, today we're going to begin chapter 7. One of our first objectives is actually one of the most important of the whole chapter is we want to be able to recognize the difference between a population parameter and a sample statistic. You'll notice that this course is called AP Statistics because when we deal with a statistic, it's actually a number that describes a sample. It's unrealistic for us to actually calculate parameters all the time because parameters identify fixed numbers that describe populations. All right, we can't really calculate information for an entire population on a regular basis, but we can calculate information for samples. So what we are usually calculating are statistics, which is why we don't call it AP parameters. We can't really find the parameters all the time. Now, we're used to, and it's easy to remember, population parameter, P and P, statistic goes with sample, S and S. All right. We are used to the population parameter of mu, representing population average, and then X bar represents your sample average. And then for standard deviations, if you remember, we had sigma for population standard deviation, and we had S for sample standard deviation. Today, and beginning with all the rest of the chapters this year, we're also going to start talking about proportions as well. A population proportion is going to be used P. All right, we're going to use P to represent a population proportion, the percentage or the proportion of people who have blue eyes or whatever. Okay, your sample proportion is going to be called P hat. Yes, that's literally its name. It's called P hat. You just put a little hat on top of P. All right, so if you read this example 1, the Gallup poll asked a random sample of 515 U.S. adults whether they believe in ghosts. Of the respondents, 160 said yes. All right, so what would be our statistic in this sample and what would be our parameter? You could have both, you could have one, you could have none, you could have two of one, none of the other. All right, so your statistic is going to be the sample of people who said yes. So this is a proportion problem. This is not the average number of U.S. adults who believe in ghosts. This is the proportion or the fraction. So we would have P hat equals 160 out of 515, and we would get 0.31. Okay, and in this problem, we weren't given any information about the entire population, so there are no parameters. For example 2, a telemarketing firm in LA uses a device that dials residential phone numbers in LA at random. Of the first 100 numbers dialed, 48% are unlisted. This is not surprising because 52% of all LA phone numbers are unlisted. So your statistic, again, you first have to ask yourself, am I dealing with a proportion or an average? That's your question for literally every problem for the rest of the year. This is dealing with a proportion, a percentage. Your sample statistic would be P hat, and the sample was the 48%. Right? We don't write 48 with the percent sign. We convert it over to 0.48. That's standard notation for our course. Our parameter is population proportion is 0.52. Example 3, a researcher carries out a randomized comparative experiment with young rats to investigate the effects of a toxic compound in food. She feeds the controlled group a normal diet. The experimental group receives a diet with 2,500 parts per million of the toxic material. After 8 weeks, the mean weight gain is 335 grams for the control group and 289 grams for the experimental group. So we were given means, so we know this problem is dealing with averages. All right. And for this problem, we actually don't have a population. This is 2 samples. So we don't have a population here, but we do have the mean for the control group was 335, and the mean for the experimental group was 289. All right, so I'm going to represent them. You could write 1 and 2. You could have written just C and E. If you write 1 and 2, you need to write what the 1 represents and what the 2 represents, whereas C, G, and E, G can be explained by control group and experimental group. All right, so now we know how to identify parameters and statistics. So now we're going to talk about sampling variability, okay? We've touched base a lot on the fact that we need to take repeated samples because when you take repeated samples, then your value of your statistic can vary. Okay, sometimes, like if we've talked about before, like if we get a group of kids and we say, how many speeding tickets have you gotten? Okay, that you probably are going to have an average of a very low number. But if you happen to have someone in that sample that you pick who had a lot of speeding tickets, then your average will be pulled higher. Okay, so depending on your variability, if you keep taking repeated samples, then you're going to have different results. I'm going to come back to this as we're working on it, but what you want to do is, as we're working through the problems, is you want to ask yourself, what would happen if we took many samples? You need to take a large number of samples from the same population, and they need to be the same sample size. You can't pick a sample of 10 and then a sample of 20. They all need to be the same sample size as you repeat your samples. You want to calculate your sample mean or your sample proportion for each sample. Okay? Before the problem begins, it's decided if you're talking about averages or proportions. You want to make them a histogram. You can also make a dot plot. They're nice and simple. And then you want to examine the distribution of the distribution displayed in the histogram or dot plot for the shape, center, and spread, just like we have always done. So take a look. Right here, I've got two sample sizes, right? And N is 16 for both. This is 16 individuals. Let's say I ask the proportion of people who believe in ghosts. All right, let's go back to that believing in ghosts. And let's say that, no, let's do, no, not believing in ghosts. Let's do, what could we use? Let's go with the tickets, all right, average number of tickets. And so if we go through tickets, all right, let's say that, would you agree the center is here? And let's say that perhaps this is one ticket, okay? This would be a person got, 0 tickets, or a person, you can't have a fraction of a ticket. So this is actually, I picked a silly example. Let's say this is number of cousins you have, okay? 10 cousins, 0 cousins, 20 cousins. So this would be a person with 2 cousins. This would be a person with 5 cousins. This could be a person with 4 cousins. This could be a person with 9 cousins, and so forth, all right? This is your cousins. Over here, I could still have a center of 10 and then 0 and 20. But this could be samples of size, 15. Let's say this is, because there's 16 dots here. Let's say this is 16 samples of size 15, and we're doing averages, okay? This was one person has 18 cousins. One person has 11 cousins. This would be 15 people have an average of 11 cousins. This would be 15 people have an average of 18 cousins. That's hard to do. If you have 15 people and they average up to have 18 cousins, that means that all 15 people have a lot of cousins, right? It is logical that one person could have 18 cousins. But to have 15 people have an average of 18 cousins, wow, that would be a lot of cousins for those 15 people. This dot would represent 15 people have an average of 1 cousin, which is very small. Okay, so based on that, that's sampling variability, how the samples vary, right? This sample average varied from this sample average, varied from this sample average. All right, so what we want to do is we want to look at a sampling distribution, okay? The sampling distribution of a statistic is the distribution of values taken by the statistic in all possible samples. I just showed you that problem with the cousins. I showed you a sampling distribution. All right. So what we want to do is we want to go through this example together. To determine how much homework time students will get in class, Mrs. Lynn has a student select a simple random sample of 20 chips from a large bag. The number of red chips in the simple random sample determines the number of minutes in class students get to work on their homework. Mrs. Lynn claims that there are 200 chips in the bag and that 100 of them, half of them, are red. When Jenna selected a random sample of 20 chips from the bag without looking, she got 7. So you would expect there to be 10, right? If it's half and she picks 20, you'd expect 10. But she got 7. So does this provide convincing evidence that actually less than half of the chips in the bag are red? Or is it just a coincidence that she got the 7? So first, what is the evidence that less than half of the chips in the bag are red? Okay, so the evidence is Jenna's sample proportion was p hat equals 7 out of 20, which is 0.35, which is less than 50. Okay, so let's provide 2 explanations for the evidence described in Part A. One explanation is Mrs. Lynn is telling the truth. Okay, Mrs. Lynn is telling the truth, and Jenna got p hat because of sampling variability. It could be that she just happened to pick a sample that was low, just like she could have picked a sample that was high. But then the other explanation is Mrs. Lynn is lying, and that actually less than half the chips in the bag are red. All right, now what I'm going to show you down here is we use a simple random sample to simulate choosing 500 simple random samples of size 20 from a population of 200 chips. The dot plot shows p hat equals the sample proportion of red chips for each of the 500 samples. So these are dots, that just wound up looking like bars when I copy pasted it. Okay, but they're actually a bunch of dots here. So you will notice that this is one sample had a proportion of 15% red. One sample had a proportion of 80% red. This is a couple samples had a proportion of 75% red. So if we take a look at the first part, question C, there is one dot plot at 0.80. Explain what this value represents. I actually just did it by accident. That means that in one simulated sample of 20 chips, there were 16 red chips. So p hat equals, right, I got 16 because 80% of 20 is 16. So p hat for this sample was 0.80. This is one sample that had 80% red chips. Okay. Would it be surprising to get a sample proportion of p hat equals 7 out of 20 like Jenna did of 0.35 or smaller if the truth is 0.5? So look, this dot plot centers at the truth, 0.5. Here's 0.35 and lower. There are actually a lot of samples that got 0.35 or lower. So no, there were many simulated samples that had p hat values less than or equal to 0.35. I'm not surprised that Jenna got that because that's all of this, right? That's all of here, which is not surprising. That's a good chunk of that dot plot. So based on your previous answers, is there convincing evidence that Mrs. Lynn was lying, that less than half of the chips in the large bag are red? And I'm going to say no. Okay, because since it isn't surprising to get p hat equals or is less than or equal to 0.35 by chance, that's a less than, alone, when p is really equal to 0.50, then we don't have convincing evidence that less than half the chips are red. Right? It could have happened by chance, you could explain. All right, it's very possible. All right, now let's say that Jenna had gotten 0.15. Then that would be just that dot. That would be surprising if that happened by chance alone. Okay, but 0.35, there's actually a good chunk of them. All right, so if she had gotten 0.15, then this answer would be, there is not, like we know that it's half, right? That it would be less than half. But since she got 0.35, that's close enough to 0.5 that there were a lot of them that could have happened by chance. All right, okay, next problem. M&Ms. All right, Mars Incorporated says that the mix of colors in M&M's milk chocolate candies is 25% blue, 25% orange, and then 12.5% for green, yellow, red, and brown. Did you know that? Okay, they don't actually plan on them being the same proportions, all the colors. All right. Assume that the company's claim is true, and you're going to randomly select 50 candies to estimate the proportion of the candies that are orange. You're going to do a test, right? And you're going to randomly pick out 50 M&Ms and go from there. So first, we want to identify your population, the parameter, the sample, and the statistics in this setting. So go ahead, try that on your own. Pause, try it on your own. And I came up with these. The population is all M&Ms. Your parameter is your proportion of orange M&Ms in that population. Your sample are the 50 candies you pick, and your statistic is the proportion of orange M&Ms in the sample. Up here, it's the proportion of orange M&Ms in the population. All right, because that's the difference between parameters and statistics. To graph your population distribution, I just threw together a nice little bar graph, okay? Percent of M&Ms, the color of the M&Ms, there you go. Okay, we're gonna skip part C. I'll link it. Okay, but I do wanna talk about part D. Which of these three graphs could be the approximate sampling distribution of your statistic? So if you take samples of size 50 over and over and over again, and you graph the proportion of oranges, right, of orange M&Ms, then which one would work? Okay, well, we can rule out this, right? This is what we got up here, okay? And this is saying frequency. So this would be one sample, because if you have a frequency of 18, a frequency of 8, a frequency of 13, or whatever that is, this is one sample of 50. We need repeated samples of 50. Sampling distribution means repeated samples of the same size. Write that down, put stars, add glitter, add fireworks, whatever you got to do. Okay, sampling distribution means repeated samples of the same sample size. So now it's between these two. Well, what are we expecting for orange? We're expecting 25% orange. So it's got to center around that. Look, this guy is wrong, because if we're expecting 25% orange, this one had no samples at 25% orange. It's too high, okay? This could work for any of the green, yellow, red, and brown, because they're all expecting 12.5%, which is about the center. Notice it doesn't need to be perfectly normal. It's a sampling distribution, okay? But here, this one centers at what we expected it to be, because the truth is P equals 0.25. So this would be the right guess. Okay, this could be the approximate sampling distribution. All right, so moving on from M&Ms, we've got a lot of vocab today. Not a lot of number crunching, lots of vocab. All right, so the next thing we want to do, objective 3, is we want to be able to determine whether or not a statistic is an unbiased estimator for, this should say for, not or, for a population parameter. So an unbiased estimator is a statistic is used to estimate a parameter is unbiased if the mean of the sampling distribution is equal to the true value of the parameter being estimated. So if your sample mean is equal to, of your sampling distribution, is equal to your population mean, then yes, it's an unbiased estimator. It didn't get pulled or swayed, right? Bias means it's being pulled or swayed one way or another. So if it's unbiased, it's not being pulled higher than the truth or lower than the truth. And if that made sense, rewind and write that down. Bias means that your sample mean is being, or sample proportion is being pulled higher or lower than the population mean or the population proportion. So here we've got this. The histogram on the left shows the interval in minutes between the Old Faithful Geyser for all 222 recorded eruptions during a particular month. For this population, the median is 75 minutes. So the population median is 75 minutes. Okay, this is the truth. This is simulated, okay? We use technology to take 500 simple random samples of size 10 from the population. The 500 values of the sample median are displayed in the histogram on the right. So they did medians, 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 medians. They did 500 different medians and graphed the medians. The average of the 500 medians is 73.5. So this one is the truth, right? There's 222 recorded eruptions. The median of those 222 eruptions was 75. This is 500 samples of size 10 simulated, and then they graphed all those medians of the samples, and then they took the average of those sample medians. Okay, so the first thing we want to say is the sample median an unbiased estimator of the population median? Well, do they equal each other? Because that's the key up here. They have to equal each other. They do not equal each other. The mean of the approximate sampling distribution of the sample median was 73.5, and that is not equal to the median of the population, 75. So since the mean of the sampling distribution of the medians is not equal to the median of the population, that means it's not an unbiased estimator. Make sure you actually answer it with no. Okay. Suppose we had taken samples of size 20 instead of size 10. Would the variability of the sampling distribution of the sample median be larger, smaller, or about the same? How would it vary from each other, the other points? Okay, well, they would vary. The variability would be what? Smaller. Okay, it would be smaller because larger samples provide more precise estimates, because larger samples include more information about the population distribution. The larger your samples get, the more accurate it gets, because we have more data to represent the whole population. So your variability will actually get smaller. The points will get closer together. The samples will all get closer together. All right. And then this one, we just want to describe the shape of the sampling distribution of the sample medians. This guy. We're going to describe this guy as nice and easy, skewed to the left and unimodal. All right. Now, I know that we're getting close and you're like, oh, Ms. Whale, this is a long lesson. I'm sorry. But I want to talk about your variability as well. Okay. Your variability of a statistic is described by the spread of its sampling distribution. We've talked about this. Larger samples give smaller spread. That's what we just discussed. As long as the population is much larger than the sample, and we're going to go into why it's 10 times as large later, then the spread of the sampling distribution is approximately the same for any population size. So I've made a couple notes here. All right, so the first important note is taking a larger sample will reduce variability. Right? It'll reduce how the samples vary from each other, but it won't necessarily eliminate bias. All right, so what I've done is I've got these four graphics for you, okay, where the dots are representing samples. This is a sample with high bias and low variability. They're not varying from each other, but they're not centered at the truth. Okay, this guy has low bias and high variability. They're spread out from each other, so they have high variability, but they have low bias because they are centered at the center of the truth. This one has high bias and high variability. It's not centered where it's supposed to be, and they're spread out. Whereas this is low bias, low variability. No bias and low variability, right? Centered where it's supposed to be, and they're all clumped together. I've broken it down over here. Bias is when your aim is off and we consistently miss the bullseye. Right? Your sample values don't center on the population value. Now, it could be the bullseye is the center you're expecting in a dot plot. Okay? Not necessarily a target. I just give you a target because it's the visual we're looking for. All right? It's an easy visual to get. Now, high variability is when repeated shots are widely scattered on the target. Repeated samples do not give very similar results. Okay. Another set of vocab words, and this is the end. Okay, another important set of vocab words to talk about is accurate versus precise. Okay, if you're accurate, that means you're centered at the right place. Whereas if you're precise, that means you have low variability. Okay, low variability is precise, whereas accurate means you're centered at the right place. It's important that if you're describing something, you use the right term. So be careful as when you're being asked to describe. Your homework that you need to get done before our next class meets, so you have concrete questions to ask, is this. All right, you're going to complete these bookwork problems, right, the free response and the multiple choice, and we're going to go over these in the next class together. Good job. I know this was long. Way to take good notes.